On the 16th of September, 1581, as dusk settled over the primary square of Neumarkt in Bavaria, a palpable tension filled the air. A large crowd had formed a tight ring around a formidable wooden structure that dominated the center of the plaza, resembling a dark, unholy altar. Atop this construction, a massive oak wheel sat in ominous silence, awaiting its grim purpose. Eager to see the impending spectacle, fathers hoisted their children onto their shoulders, ensuring they wouldn't miss a moment. There was a collective understanding among the onlookers. They were about to witness an event of unparalleled significance. This was the day justice would be served upon the most dreaded man in the entire German region. Soon, the guards emerged from the city jail, dragging with them a figure that looked scarcely human. This was Peter Neers, a man whose decades of unspeakable atrocities had transformed him into a malevolent legend, a specter that haunted the forests and roadways of the nation. His face, a canvas of scars and etched with the cruelty of a life dedicated to pure evil, showed nothing but scorn for the sea of faces staring back at him. In a few short moments, he was scheduled to meet his end through one of the most savage methods of execution ever devised by mankind. He was to be broken on the wheel, a punishment where every bone in his body would be methodically shattered before the flames of a pyre consumed him alive. But this prompts a profound question. How does an individual devolve into such a fearsome monster that his demise must be orchestrated as an unprecedented exhibition of horror? The search for that answer takes us back to the blood-soaked trails of 16th century Europe, where Peter Neers carved his name into the annals of history as one of the most prolific serial killers who ever lived. The saga of Peter Neers starts in a childhood defined by neglect and abject poverty. Born around the year 1540 in the Franconian region, his formative years were set against a backdrop of a Europe ravaged by religious conflict, widespread famine, and the relentless march of the plague. Left an orphan at a young age, he was forced to wander the roads as a beggar. It was during this desperate period that he unearthed a talent for something far more sinister than begging: murder. Initially, Neers's crimes were driven by the primal need to survive. He would ambush lone travelers on desolate paths, killing them for a handful of coins or a simple loaf of bread. However, what started as a grim necessity soon morphed into a much darker compulsion. Peter came to realize that he didn't just commit murder to survive. He relished the act itself. He did not merely stomach the violence required for his robberies. He savored it, he extended it, he perfected it into a cruel art form. For over 4 decades, Neers became a terror that haunted the vital trade routes connecting Franconia and Bavaria. His targets were typically merchants, religious pilgrims, and any wayfarer unfortunate enough to cross his path. Yet, Peter was far from being a common highwayman. He devised and implemented sophisticated methods of torture, deliberately keeping his victims alive for days on end while he subjected them to torments beyond imagination. Historical accounts from that era depict Peter Neers as a man of average height, but possessing formidable physical strength. His eyes were often described as being utterly devoid of a soul, and his hands, perpetually stained with blood, were said to tremble not from fear, but from a twisted excitement that only the act of violence could quell. He often traveled with a small band of accomplices, men as depraved as himself, but Neers was invariably the leader, the one who orchestrated the attacks and ultimately decided the gruesome fate of their captives. What elevated Peter Neers to a figure of supreme terror was not just the sheer volume of his victims, estimated to be more than 500 people over his criminal career, but the deeply ritualistic and grotesque nature of his crimes. He cultivated a morbid fascination with cannibalism, frequently consuming parts of his victims' bodies and preserving other fragments as macabre souvenirs. Surviving reports from the period state that he was never without a leather pouch in which he kept a collection of severed fingers, ears, and other human remains. But an even more unsettling dimension to Peter's madness existed. He held a fervent, unwavering belief that by consuming human flesh, he could acquire supernatural abilities. This conviction steered him towards a particular and horrifying preference for children, whose hearts he would devour while they were still warm, convinced that this gruesome act would grant him the power of invincibility. Survivors of his assaults recounted seeing him muttering strange incantations as he performed these cannibalistic rituals, adding a layer of black magic to his already monstrous reputation. Peter Neers' sinister fame spread like a contagion throughout the German territories. His name became a tool for parents to discipline unruly children, a whispered threat of what lurked in the shadows. Travelers began to actively alter their itineraries, taking long and arduous detours simply to avoid the regions where he was known to operate. Authorities, desperate to end his reign of terror, posted increasingly substantial rewards for his capture, dead or alive. Yet, time and again, he managed to slip through their grasp, almost as if he were shielded by some diabolical force. The local magistrates organized numerous large-scale expeditions to hunt him down. But Peter's familiarity with the land was unmatched. He knew every hidden trail, every secluded cave, and every possible hiding spot within the dense forests of the region. He had effectively transformed this territory into a personal kingdom, an extension of his own malevolent will. He solidified his power by building a network of informants comprised of lesser criminals and desperate individuals, whom he offered protection in return for their unwavering loyalty. For decades, Peter Nears persisted as a bloody phantom, a specter of death looming over the heart of Bavaria. But as with all monsters, human or otherwise, their reign eventually comes to an end, often through their own arrogance. Peter's critical error was underestimating the resolve of one specific man, George Amann, the respected magistrate of Neumarkt. Amann was not just an officer of the law. He was a man driven by a deeply personal vendetta, as his own family had been brutally slaughtered by Nears many years prior. Amann devoted his life single-mindedly to the goal of bringing the serial killer to justice. He meticulously studied Nears's patterns of attack, he mapped his known movements, and he successfully infiltrated the killer's network of contacts with his own spies. Finally, in August of 1581, his painstaking efforts paid off. He managed to corner Peter Nears in a remote, isolated cabin deep within the forest, where the criminal had sought refuge following his latest massacre. The capture of Peter Nears was a momentous event, sending shockwaves throughout the entire region. When the news broke, people from all corners of the land flocked to Neumarkt, eager to lay eyes on the man who had haunted their lives and become a living legend of terror. Confined in the city's dungeons, he continued to exhibit deeply disturbing behavior, frequently bursting into laughter for no apparent reason and muttering strings of incomprehensible words to himself. The trial of Peter Nears was less a formal legal proceeding and more a public affirmation of his guilt. The evidence stacked against him was staggering and irrefutable. There were hundreds of witnesses who could place him at the scenes of his crimes, dozens of survivors who bravely came forward to recount their horrific ordeals, and, most damningly, the discovery of his own macabre trophies in his possession. But what truly sealed his fate was his own confession. During his interrogation, Peter not only admitted to his countless crimes but described them in sickening, exhaustive detail, seeming to take a perverse pride in his life's work. He spoke with chilling detachment about his specific torture techniques, the taste of human flesh, and the dark rituals he believed imbued him with unholy power. His accounts were so graphic and disturbing that some officials present in the courtroom were forced to leave, overcome with nausea. The sentence was delivered with grave and solemn ceremony. Peter Nears was to be executed by the breaking wheel. However, given the unprecedented scale and depravity of his crimes, the authorities decreed that his would not be an ordinary execution. He was to suffer an especially drawn-out and brutal version of the punishment. The process would begin with torture by red-hot pincers. Following that, his bones would be systematically broken, one by one. And finally, while still clinging to life, he would be burned alive. The execution was set for September 16th, a date that was promptly declared a local holiday, a celebration of justice triumphing over evil. In the days leading up to the event, a steady stream of pilgrims, merchants, and curious onlookers traveled from distant cities, all converging on Neumarkt to witness the end of the man who had terrorized the region for so long. On the morning of his execution, Peter Nears was led into the center of Neumarkt's main square. The crowd that had assembled was so immense that the city guard had to call in reinforcements just to maintain a semblance of order. Amidst the throng, street vendors moved about, selling food and drink, transforming the grim occasion into a bizarre and macabre public fair. The instruments of execution had been specially constructed for this very event. The great oak wheel measured more than 6 feet in diameter and was mounted on a structure that allowed it to be rotated slowly, ensuring maximum suffering. Beside it, several braziers glowed, heating pincers and branding irons until they were incandescent. Nearby, a large pile of dry kindling lay waiting for the final, fiery act of the gruesome spectacle. Peter Nears was stripped of his clothing and securely bound to the wheel with thick, coarse ropes. Even in this final, desperate moment, he displayed no sign of fear, no hint of remorse. His eyes remained vacant and cold, as if this terrible reality was merely another of the countless nightmares he had inflicted upon hundreds of other people throughout his life of bloodshed. The torture commenced with the application of the red-hot pincers to specific points on his body. The executioner, a master of his grim trade specially hired for the occasion, began with Niers's feet, then moved to his hands, and finally to his chest. With each searing touch of the iron, skin sizzled and popped, and the sickening stench of burning flesh wafted across the square, a smell that would haunt the memories of all who were present. Peter Niers let out horrifying screams, yet they seemed to be born more of pure rage than of pain, as if he was infuriated by his own helplessness in the face of this overwhelming agony. After what felt like an eternity but was in fact an hour of this initial torment, the main phase of the execution began, the systematic breaking of his bones. The executioner, wielding a heavy iron-shod hammer, started with the smallest bones, the fingers of his hands and feet. One by one, each was meticulously shattered, producing a series of sharp, dry cracks that echoed through the morbidly silent crowd. The process of breaking the larger bones was even more savage. Niers's forearms were positioned carefully on the edge of the great oak wheel and then crushed with precise, powerful blows. His legs, his upper arms, and his ribs were subjected to the same brutal treatment. With every impact, he howled in unimaginable pain, but his voice steadily weakened as the shock and massive blood loss began to take their inevitable toll. This entire procedure, the deliberate and methodical destruction of his skeleton, lasted for more than 2 agonizing hours. By the time it was over, the man known as Peter Niers was no longer recognizable as a human being. His body had been reduced to a shapeless, pulped mass of flesh and shattered bone, a testament to the brutal justice of the era. Yet, incredibly, he remained alive, still conscious, and fully capable of feeling every excruciating second of his prolonged agony. Then came the final act. The pile of kindling beneath the wheel was set ablaze. The flames began to slowly lick at Peter's mangled feet, gradually creeping up his mutilated body, a final, fiery purification. Even at this ultimate moment, even as he faced the most horrific death conceivable, he did not cry out for forgiveness or beg for mercy. His last moments on earth were defined by the same cold, unyielding hatred that had characterized his entire monstrous existence. From the first touch of the hot pincers to the moment the flames finally consumed what was left of his body, the execution of Peter Niers lasted nearly 5 hours. When the inferno finally died down, his ashes were carefully gathered and scattered to the 4 winds, a symbolic gesture to ensure that no physical trace of his profound evil would ever remain on the earth. The death of Peter Niers signified the conclusion of a long and bloody era of terror for the region. The roads gradually became safe for travel once more. Families could journey between towns without the constant fear of ambush, and the name that had haunted an entire generation slowly faded, becoming nothing more than a dark and cautionary memory. However, the story of Peter Niers leaves us grappling with unsettling questions about the very nature of human evil. How is it possible for a man to become a monster so utterly devoid of humanity? What specific circumstances can conspire to transform an abandoned orphan into a cannibalistic serial killer who preys on the innocent? And perhaps most critically, what lessons can be gleaned from his horrific life story to help us prevent other Peter Nierses from emerging in our own world? A potential answer may lie in the sheer brutality of the time in which he lived. In a society where extreme violence was a common occurrence, where human life was often considered cheap, and where orphaned children were frequently abandoned to fend for themselves, the emergence of someone like Peter Niers was perhaps an almost predictable outcome. He was a twisted product of his environment, an extreme and horrifying manifestation of the darkness that can fester in the most shadowed corners of the human soul. Today, more than 4 centuries later, the main square in Neumarkt is a tranquil and picturesque place. Tourists meander through, buying souvenirs, while local families enjoy picnics on the grass. Very few of them are aware that on that very spot, centuries ago, one of history's most malevolent figures met his gruesome end on a torture wheel. Yet, if one listens closely to the wind as it whispers between the ancient, stoic buildings, it might be possible to hear the faint echoes of that brutal execution, an event that marked the violent end of a legend of terror. The story of Peter Niers, the criminal who was burned, mutilated, and crushed on the wheel, endures as a chilling reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, justice, in one form or another, eventually finds a way to prevail. And even if that justice arrives in its most brutal and primitive form, it still signifies the ultimate victory of civilization over savagery, of light over darkness, and of good over absolute, unadulterated evil. The story of Peter Niers serves as a brutal intersection of history, folklore, and the darkest aspects of human psychology. While his death brought a tangible sense of relief and a return to safety for the people of Bavaria, the questions left in the wake of his horrific life are not so easily settled. His legacy endures not just as a historical account of a serial killer, but as a profound and disturbing case study in the genesis of evil. How does a human being become so completely alienated from their own species that they view others as mere objects for consumption and sadistic pleasure? The answer, buried under centuries of history, is likely a horrifying confluence of a person and their time. The 16th century was a crucible of violence. Europe was a continent in turmoil, torn apart by religious schisms, enduring recurrent famines, and haunted by the specter of the plague. In such a world, life was cheap, and suffering was a daily reality for the vast majority. For an orphaned child like Peter Nears, abandoned to the unforgiving roads, the world would have offered no comfort, no morality, only a relentless struggle for survival. His initial crimes, born of desperation, were a common tragedy of the era. However, Nears's path diverged from that of a common bandit when he discovered a profound and perverse joy in the act of killing. This is where the environment alone ceases to be a sufficient explanation. Something else, a deep-seated pathology, must have been present within him. In modern terms, he would likely be diagnosed as a severe psychopath, devoid of empathy and driven by a narcissistic and sadistic lust for power. His descent into cannibalism and ritualistic magic marks his complete departure from the shared reality of his fellow humans. Nears's belief that consuming the flesh of his victims, especially the hearts of fetuses and children, would grant him supernatural powers like invisibility and invincibility is particularly telling. In an age rife with superstition, where the lines between the natural and supernatural were blurred, such beliefs were not entirely alien. However, for Nears, they became a core component of his murderous ideology. This was not merely a means of survival, it was a twisted spiritual quest for godlike power, a way to transcend his wretched origins by becoming a literal consumer of life. His bag of macabre trophies, the severed fingers and ears, were not just souvenirs, they were artifacts of his power, tangible proof of his dominion over others. Furthermore, the nature of his execution speaks volumes about the society that both created and destroyed him. The spectacle in Newmarkt's main square was more than just a punishment, it was a piece of brutal public theater. The presence of vendors, the festive atmosphere, and the massive crowds all point to a culture where public execution was a form of communal catharsis and grim entertainment. By subjecting Nears to an execution of unimaginable cruelty, torture with hot pincers, the systematic shattering of every bone while alive, and finally, being burned to death, the authorities were not just ending a life. They were reasserting their power in the most visceral way possible. They were using Nears's own methods of terror against him, demonstrating that the state's capacity for violence far outstripped that of any individual. The prolonged, 5-hour ordeal was a message. This is the fate that awaits those who defy God and society. It was a victory of civilization over barbarity, but a victory achieved through barbarous means. Today, the wind that blows through the peaceful square in Newmarkt carries no scent of burned flesh, and the ground holds no memory of the blood that was spilled there. The story of Peter Nears has become a dark footnote in history, a tale to be recounted with a shudder, but it is a story that should not be forgotten. It serves as a permanent and chilling reminder that the capacity for absolute evil is not a fictional concept but a human potential. It illustrates how a society's neglect and brutality can fester within an individual, twisting them into something unrecognizable. The line between a desperate orphan and a cannibalistic monster may be finer than we are comfortable with. The tale of Peter Nears, the man who was broken on the wheel, is a testament to the darkness that lurks in the shadowed corners of history and the human soul, a warning that the specter of such evil, though dormant, is never truly gone.